podcast. I am sitting with
Nicholas. I write video game reviews for conversatio.com.
Eric, I'm a teacher, sometimes writer.
François, librarian and sometimes writer.
Chris, sometimes writer and subtitle editor.
And I am Dimitri, webmaster of thedreamersedge.com and movie critic, and also I'm beginning to think I know this speech by heart. We're continuing our journey down cinematic history. We've reached the 60s. This week, Eric and Chris are going to list their picks for the best of the 60s. But before we do all that, Chris, you've started a tradition of talking about the decade a little bit.
Oh, really? That's like the preamble.
Yeah.
Dude, if you remember the 60s, it's because you weren't there, man.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. The 60s. What can we not say about it? You know, it's the baby boomers have forced them down our throat for generations, or decades anyway. But it's a period in, I guess, movie history in a way where it's just like you can actually see that break where it's like you went suddenly from like black and white to color film. You start seeing really more the auteur film style coming up. There's a lot of modernist stuff happening. Then there's a lot of experimental stuff. You know, obviously, it's a really explosive period in time. You know, just with like the music and the pop and the art, everything happening at once. You know, and really, it's mass communication is almost happening. Television is happening, and you can see ideas are almost being circulated more quickly. And as a result, the film is actually quite interesting. You know, so. For myself, I didn't find it really difficult at all to find some really good choices.
Mm-hmm. It's because we weren't really there in the 60s to see all of those horrible films. Like when we have like the 80s or the 90s, we all went to the movies, we all rented them, so we had like tons that, oh man, I really hated that one.
I channeled some of my previous slides in order to get a better perspective. Fortunately, one of them was a hippie, so I keep, for some reason, having the knee-jerk reaction that, you know, the best thing to come out in the 60s cinematically was Jefferson Airplane videos, I was going to say. But Cheech and Chong 70s, man. And on that really weird non-sequitur.
Eric.
So number 3 for me is a movie that I truly love, and whenever I see it, I can't help but watch it, is Dr. Zhivago.
You know what? I was like 97% sure you would pick that for some reason.
Yeah, I love it. Julie Christie, who was absolutely gorgeous way back when, she still looks good, but absolutely stunning, and Omar Sharif. Yeah. I just love that film, and it was that kind of really big studio movie with David Lean, like. It felt like very epic.
Yeah, the late 50s and the 60s really did that epic 2 VHS movie experience. Really,
exactly.
Really well.
And a cast of thousands.
Exactly.
And sometimes they bankrupt the studios.
My number 2 is actually very small scale compared to Dr. Zhivago. It's The Graduate.
95% chance of
You can just read me, can't you?
Yeah, I think we were spending a lot of time doing the predictions thing. This is like, you know, the prelude to a football game where all the guys are like doing the, you know, pre-game analysis.
So basically the movie is Dustin Hoffman, who graduated from university, and he goes back home, and he doesn't really know what he wants to do with his life.
Who he wants to do.
Yeah, exactly. And he...
Wow.
Yeah, the whole thing with Mrs. Robinson and...
Spoiler.
Yeah, exactly. But even the way that it's filmed, it's very bizarre. It feels more handheld and lots of weird close-ups, and it's not the typical film that you would see. And that's one thing that I enjoyed the most, where he comes out like in his gear and he goes deep sea diving like in his own pool. Lots of funny lines, and Dustin Hoffman is great in it. And it was that kind of thing of, here's this guy that doesn't really know, and all of a sudden he's just bored at home, and he's doing all of these things just to keep boredom at bay, if you will. And I could definitely relate to that.
Yeah, the 60s and Dustin Hoffman are really go hand in hand.
Yeah,
sure.
exactly.
And he's such a talented actor. And, this movie was...
Problem is that you could also say that for the 70s, but I get your point. Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't that also one of the very first movies to really use a pop soundtrack, like actual?
Oh, Simon and Garfunkel.
Simon and Garfunkel, which was like really big at the time, and then like they basically take that and make it as a soundtrack. I'm not saying that movies before hadn't used a song at from the time.
I think the Beatles had a couple movies in the 60s.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's definitely a film that I enjoy a lot, and whenever I see it, obviously I'll watch it again. And my number one pick, I don't know, Dimitri. What do you think I picked?
Oh, don't put me on the spot like that.
Mr. 95%, 97.
Dr. Strangelove. I'll just
Yes.
cut it.
So my number one pick is Dr. Strangelove. I'm definitely a big Stanley Kubrick fan, and that one is the movie that I find the funniest.
It's only comedy.
Huh? No, but he does. No, but yes, obviously, but he doesn't have much of a sense of humor like in most of his films.
Which are not comedy.
Yeah, I know, but even then,
Clockwork Orange, man, a lot of missed opportunities for a couple of laughs.
but just really funny. Peter Sellers is just hilarious constantly, especially when he plays the president. Stuff like this.
Well, Doctor Strangelove, I think, I personally love the Mind Field thing, but
yeah,
it's very good.
Yeah, and it's like
here. This is the war room.
Exactly. And just when he's talking to the Russian president and everything else, it's just a film that you see it over and over again, and some of the visuals, the guy riding the bomb.
Well, it was Pickett, I think. His whole bit, as the commander of the bomber, is hilarious. Like at one point when he goes through the survival kit they have in case they have to ditch the plane, and I think it's like, man, somebody could have a pretty good time in Vegas with this, or words to that effect. Obviously, Dr. Strangelove himself. I also recall that George C. Scott, who was an actor who always took his craft seriously, but very rarely did comedies, except certain roles early on stage, and he was actually shocked because he said, "Wow, I'm actually funny." He wasn't quite sure how to approach the role. But General Kilgore, he really sort of
and one of the funny stories is usually he would kind of bully directors into, having his way and doing whatever he wanted, and Stanley Kubrick, turns out, was an incredible chess player. So he brought a chess game, and they would play with each other, and just that's how he kind of won George C. Scott's respect. And then whenever he would say, "Oh, why don't you try this?" for some reason he would do it, because every time the cameras were rolling, he would try to beat him, and there Stanley would come in and just 2 moves put him checkmate.
Two moves.
That's cheating.
That make us our chess expert. Now, is that actually possible?
It is possible, but it requires a lot of help from the
other player.
For your player.
I was going to say, the
There
other
you go.
player's got to be really stupid to keep doing that.
You get my meaning.
Yeah, no, that's a great film. It's such a dark comedy, and the subtitle really kind of really brings it forward. It's like Doctor Strangelove, or whatever it is.
How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb.
Oh, there we go.
And it's, when you think about it, you know what I mean? In the 80s, you know what I mean? When we were growing up, or most of us were growing up. Sorry, Nick. There's all this talk about nuclear disarmament. You know what I mean? So it was still part of our consciousness. You know what I mean? But in the 60s, the bomb was really in the forefront of no, it could still drop.
Well, I think the early 80s had that sense, particularly with Reagan as a president and the day after by Nicholas Meyer. But I understand where you're getting. They just had the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's a reality to it that was perhaps a little...
really raw. You know what I mean? So this type of comedy, you know what I mean, when it comes out, it's just it's bleak.
And the ending itself, the song superimposed to the image, I thought was such a stroke of... Yeah, you got that weird sense of I'm laughing, but I really shouldn't be.
Yeah, no, good choices, Eric. I'm going to top them now.
Throwing down.
Here they come. Number 3. You know, and everyone who's been listening, you know, like obviously I've got a certain genre stance, you know, or slant anyway.
Oh, I think I know.
I think
Really?
a
Yeah.
gender prejudice.
All right, bring it on.
In Cold Blood.
No.
Strike.
1962, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I never would have guessed that one.
Really?
Good pick, though.
This is, you know, speaking about black and whites, you know what I mean? Like, it's an early 60s film by John Ford, one of the John Ford, John Wayne collaborations, you know, classic team, you know, of actor or director kind of almost inventing the actor in a way, you know. And in this case, John Wayne's already aging. And this is a Western, for those who haven't seen it. But it's basically, he plays the old style of what Law is. You know, he's the sheriff at West. Jimmy Stewart, you know, again, you know, a face that everyone knows, you know, he's the likable guy. He's the guy from the city. He's a lawyer. And you've got these two ideas of what law and justice are and where it kind of translates into something different in a different environment. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful film. I really, really like it. It's, you know, if you haven't seen it, it's great.
I'm sort of fascinated by the Western as this vehicle for, you know, examining how America achieved greatness. Like, I think it's a lost art now. A lot of people look back to that period, and particularly at Westerns, and see something that is so outdated. And the thing is, I think you can learn a lot, you know, just about movies, about movie making, but about America itself by watching that period, because it's really a self-reflective
It's
aspect.
very much something that they're telling a story about themselves.
Yeah.
A story they wanted to understand, you know,
Yeah.
and so they're really interesting.
And there are competing philosophies even within the storytelling, you know, and yeah, towards the, you know, with the spaghetti westerns towards the end of the 60s, then, you know, like you've got the rise of, you know, let's make it about violence and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Clint Eastwood comes in, and, you know, by that time you've got something that's entirely different. But that period, even though like it's sometimes like really over the top, and John Wayne is, I don't know, like kind of a controversial figure.
Oh, no,
like
yes,
really,
for sure. He's very stylized, you know,
yeah,
and so are these films, you know, so it actually works, you know. So I would say track it down, give it the time, and it's really is great. 1961, The Hustler.
Ooh.
You know, I think the 60s, you know, if you've got to choose something, you've got to choose some Paul Newman, because the guy was just
he
amazing.
was really good in that.
He's so hot.
He hustles.
Actually, I'm intrigued that you took the Hustler and not Cool Hand Luke.
Yeah, no, this one, it's because it's almost like The Con, which I think is very quintessential American
And
storytelling. You know?
revisits that role in The Color of Money.
Exactly. You know, and
With Tom
so,
Cruise.
but the fact that, you know, it's Paul Newman, George C. Scott in a non-funny role, and Jackie Gleason. And Jackie Gleason in this one is
Steals the
just
show.
brilliant. But you've got this young guy who's being mentored, and you've got this, you know, just like this, such a minute skill when you get down to it, and just people kind of living on their wits, you know, and finding love where they can, and trying to outdo each other. And it's just like, and it's another black and white film, so this is like, you know, almost like a throwback to the 50s, but it's such a good little like character piece, and it's heartbreaking to watch. For people who,
I thought it was
for people who
interesting.
haven't seen it, it's basically The Hustler here is like, it's a pool game hustle, you know, where it's just like someone will go in, pretend not to be good, and basically con people out of their money, you know, and just...
But the Paul Newman character in the love story I thought was really interesting, because we're talking about people that are sort of living on the outskirts of society. They're not really in a world that's necessarily very noble according to the times, and yet they are portrayed in a somewhat sympathetic light. And, you know, we're still talking about an era where if you were, you know, exuding certain qualities, you would win. You know, his love interest is kind of like, I mean, divorcee, almost fallen woman. You know, you've got that aspect of it that it, I don't know, like, I mean, not to say that these weren't characters that weren't played before, but in the 50s they would tend to be very sort of like, okay, everything's gonna...
Yeah, you almost
Goes
feel like,
back
yeah,
to
exactly, like shades of Streetcar Named Desire or something. You know, it's just like, you know, like these sexualized people, you know, almost like, you know, like maybe they're immigrants. Who knows? You know what I mean? But like normal people aren't living that low, so to speak. You know what I mean? Like, you know what I mean? It's almost like, you know, it's like the very top-down look at it. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like, no, like you should be a banker. You should be this. You should be like... No, this is very urban storytelling. You know, you've got these people living in small apartments. There's no air conditioning. They're sweating.
Yeah.
but they're still kissing each other, finding each other attractive, and it's just like, it's just like, and the big thing is like making coffee on the stove,
Yeah.
and it's just like, it's great little films.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you haven't seen it, watch it, and then like 20 years later, they kind of reprised the role in The Color of Money with Tom Cruise.
Yeah.
I've heard of this actor.
Yeah, I know.
yeah.
He's actually very annoying in the film.
Yeah. So
Well,
really,
that's his character.
it
Yeah,
is.
no, but
Yeah.
he does it too well.
He's he's very natural at conveying that.
And then number one, you know what I mean? Of course, I've got to choose a real crime thing, here, and here's my backdoor suggestion is I wanted something that kind of conveyed a sense of unease, you know what I mean? Like, because I find the thrillers of the 60s are not thrillers of the 90s or the thrillers of the aughts, you know what I mean? Like, you're going into a different world, you've got to look at them in different ways, so it's just, but still there's a chill and there's a thrill there. So one of the ones that I like in terms of developing unease is Cape Fear, the Robert Mitchum one. But then I was like, it's, almost sullied by its remake, so, but I was trying to get something that kind of brought that kind of feeling to it, and I think, I can't talk about the 60s without bringing Hitchcock into it, and I think The Birds is really, in terms of just overall creepiness, is the one I'm going to go with, and
I have to say that's a very interesting pick. Yeah, The Birds is really it's a very unnerving movie. Like, and Hitchcock was, I don't know who came up with that idea, but I have to say the fact that it's never explained is perhaps the most creepy
and that's
part of all. But
cleverly done in terms of special effects, in terms of budget, in terms of everything, but it's just like, and so in terms of craftsmanship, it's interesting,
But The Birds was really creepy, especially like the ending where they're driving and you see all the birds. Right? Oh my God! I still remember that image when
you're sort of like you're.
Yeah, I was a kid and my dad was watching it. I watched it with him, and I was like,
You didn't like seagulls ever again.
No, not at all.
Just that sense of anything that could swarm and outnumber you. You know what I mean? Like, it's like you can't punch them. You can't. You know what I mean? Like, there's gonna. Like, I don't know.
They're not even safe.
They're not even Nazis.
I don't know. If you can't punch a bird, I think you're not trying hard enough.
There's a swarm of them. You just punch. You'll get one.
Guys,
Their bones are hollow.
guys.
No,
Go to Lafleur's, buy a huge bag of French fries, and you're good. Just like throw them around.
No kidding. The Birds is actually in my list of worst.
Really?
Yeah,
Dun, dun,
I really do not like.
You don't
that
buy the
movie
bird
at all.
conspiracy. Why would they get together and do this?
Well, you're not. Oddly, you're not too far off. The thing is, I think The Bird works or doesn't based on your own personal fear of birds. And the fact is, I'm not scared of birds at all. So the whole movie,
Neither was I until I saw the film.
The effect it had on me was like, this is kind of silly. Like this, I never got past the silliness.
For me, it was kind of like nothing I would have been afraid of before, but I realized that if anything's going to attack me in that number, I'm going to be scared. You know what I mean?
If anything attacks you in
It
that
could
number,
be
you're going
squirrels.
to be.
I have that. It could be squirrels at the park. It's like a vector that we can't control. Just like Jaws freaks me out because it's something coming from beneath.
Mm-hmm.
This is something coming from above. Normally, we're not looking up until something hits you in the back of the head. Just like normally I'm not looking down until like a fish rips off my leg. It's freaky.
So basically, you're never looking.
No, I'm
anywhere.
saying no. I'm not looking. I try not to drive. So no, it's not a perfect film in any way, but it brings that level of unease that
And
I
it's
like,
not always
and
the most
menace.
dangerous
And there's a
animal.
level of menace to it that I like. It's not just the cheap scares of something like Alien, where like dark. Oh, it's then the cat screams, and you're like everyone jumps. It's nothing like that. It's just like there's just this level of unease where it's just like, what is this thing? You know what I mean? And I liked it.
A lot of the stuff in the movie that I don't like also is just based on the era. Hitchcock, unfortunately, his movies are a product of its time in terms of the treatment of women. And I think The Birds has just about the most obnoxious female characters in any Hitchcock movie. Where they just sort of stand there and wait for the birds to attack them and just go, ooh, ooh, ah, ah. And of course you can't blame Hitchcock for that. It's a product of its time, but it always grates me.
So it would have been better if, like, you know, like all of a sudden the chick lays out the M60 with the ammo belt,
and saves her friend by shooting the bird with a shotgun while it's still on the guy's face.
Notice you said the word chick.
Yeah, not unintended.
I guess it's just I don't get into animal horror is what it comes down to. Arachnophobia, nothing.
Well, that was a Thrillometer.
Food of the gods, nothing.
Food of the gods.
And that's giant rats.
Okay.
Right.
That's why you didn't like Birdemic. I mean,
Hey, thank you for trying because I've been trying to find a way to bring it to Birdemic. I was gonna go like, I like its remake better, but
Birdemic.
Because Birdemic, like that was true shock and terror to me.
To most of us.
the birds. It was freaky. I don't know what you're talking about. Like people say, enough of the one thing, you know, will scare you. I'm not afraid of insects, but, you know, at one point when you have a swarm of ants on you, you're going to freak out. You know, so it's the same thing with birds. Even though they're, okay, birds are silly, they fly around, they look weak, but, you know, the way
they look weak, they could shit on you.
The way
in your mouth.
That is gross. You're right. If you're driving and they all shit in your windshield, you're doing.
Everyone's crashing.
Well, it's not just the aspect of swarm. They move with purpose. Like all of a sudden, like it's the whole notion that all of a sudden there's something. Yeah. That for the longest time was just okay. They're dumb animals, but now all of a sudden they get organized. The very concept would be enough to unnerve anyone.
They're going to fuck you up.
Oh, that is a winner.
I think we found the tagline for the movie. Okay.
Flock that.
You just
Really?
said the same
I
You just repeated what he said.
I'm sorry, but
Chris's was good, I admit.
Eric, must we go over the rules again? No piggyback joking. Once the punchline is made, you don't get to reuse it.
Oh, I'm reusing it.
A punchline that awesome. Come on, you have to.
Your words. I didn't quite say it, but it was pretty awesome.
Alright, so if you want to share your thoughts about the birds and all the other movies we've listed today, you can write us at mail@thedreamersedge.com or post a comment at thedreamersedge.com. We're also on Facebook, we're also on Twitter, we're also on iTunes. And next time, Nick, Frank, and I will share our picks for best movies of the 60s, so stay tuned. Bye.
I'm just pointing things
Mila
out.
Jovovich has been. Is she been tapped on the shoulder for that movie? The remake. Mila Jovovich.
No.
So I really think we're Resident Evil the Birds. Would that work?
I'm not even sure how you came up with that joke.
Well, it's not so much a joke as something that.
No, it's not a joke,
shouldn't
right?
Jokes are punchlines, man! We've reached the 60s. This week, Eric and Chris are going to list their picks for the best of the 60s. But before we do all that, Chris, you've started a tradition of talking about the decade a little bit.
Oh, really? Like the preamble.
Yeah.
Dude, if you remember the 60s, it's because you weren't there, man.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. The 60s. What can we not say about it? You know, it's the baby boomers have forced them down our throat for generations, or decades anyway. But it's a period in, I guess, movie history in a way where it's just like, Eric.
So number 3 for me is a movie that I truly love, and whenever I see it, I can't help but watch it, is Dr. Zhivago.
You know what? I was like 97% sure you would pick that for
Yeah.
some reason.
Yeah, I love it. Julie Christie, who was absolutely gorgeous way back when, she still looks good, but absolutely stunning, and Omar Sharif.
Yeah.
I just love that film, and it was that kind of really, because we weren't really there in the 60s to see all of those horrible films. Like when we have like the 80s or the 90s, we all went to the movies, we all rented them, so we had like tons that, oh man, I really hated that one.
I channeled some of my previous slides in order to get a better perspective. Fortunately, one of them was a hippie, so I keep, for some reason, having the knee-jerk reaction that, the best thing that come out in the 60s cinematically was Jefferson Airplane videos, I was going to say. But Cheech and Chong 70s, man. And on that really weird non-sequitur.
You can actually see that break where it's like you went suddenly from like black and white to color film. You start seeing really more the auteur film style coming up. There's a lot of modernist stuff happening. Then there's a lot of experimental stuff. Obviously it's a really explosive period in time. Just with like the music and the pop and the art, everything happening at once. And really, it's mass communication is almost happening. Television is happening. And you can see ideas are almost being circulated more quickly, and as a result, the film is actually quite interesting. So for myself, I didn't find it really difficult at all to find some really good choices.
Mm-hmm. It's because.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Dreamer's Edge podcast. I am sitting with
Nicholas. I write video game reviews for theDreamersEdge.com.
Eric, I'm a teacher, sometimes writer.
François, librarian and sometimes writer.
Chris, sometimes writer and subtitle editor.
And I am Dimitri, webmaster of theDreamersEdge.com and movie critic, and also I'm beginning to think I know this speech by heart. We're continuing our journey down cinematic history.